Okay, so just quick thing about the quizzes. We're going to be doing 12 of them total, right? This is number 2. And I'm going to be dropping the 2 lowest grades. So if you happen not to do well on a quiz, right, don't freak out about it. You'll have opportunities to come back from it. And the grade might be replaced by a later, better score. The other thing I want to suggest, if you find so the quizzes aren't meant to be unfair, right? What I'm trying to do is make sure that as long as everybody's doing the reading and coming to class and taking notes, you can pass the reading quizzes and the vocab quizzes. If you're having trouble with the reading quizzes, one of the best things you can probably do for yourself is honestly this. You see what I do in my books. I just whenever I see something that I have a question about, or that looks like an important detail, or that I have thoughts about, right? I make a note of it. Now, if you rented the textbook, and I think it looks like I might see a rental sticker on there, you can do the same thing but with sticky notes. But the good thing about this is that when you you can see I've got this in 3 different colors of pen, right? Because I've read through this so many different times. You can almost kind of have a conversation with yourself about what you're reading, and it's interesting to see how your ideas develop when you go back and look at something again, right? But yeah, if you find you're having trouble just remembering things for the quizzes, honestly, just doing a little bit of writing, taking notes in your textbook, will help you connect what you're thinking to what's in the book. The other thing that I just wanted to quickly mention, so I've been doing some thinking about presentation assignments. I'll probably announce those next week, but you're an exercise science major, right? So what I was thinking for you was when we get to World War I poetry, maybe if you wanted to look at the way they talk about health and physical fitness in some of those poems. And that way you can apply the stuff you're actually doing in your major classes to what you're doing here, and maybe we can find some connections. Does that sound good to you, or does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Okay, so before we start talking about the Equiano, let's just go over last week's vocab quiz. So, public sphere. Do you remember what the public sphere was? Okay. So the public sphere is this idea it's formulated by a German philosopher named Jürgen Habermas in the 1960s, but he's actually talking about something that comes into existence earlier, right? So he sees the public sphere, as we know it, as coming into existence in the 18th century with the rise in literacy rates and the drop in the cost of print materials, right? So you got the printing press, so you can mass produce all kinds of print materials. And as print materials become cheaper and more people are able to read, things like newspapers and pamphlets become an important part of public debate, right? You also have these places like coffee houses that are opening up where people will gather and debate scientific issues or political issues or economic issues. And so the space opens up in the 18th century for greater public participation in issues of importance, right? And that's what the public sphere is. We were talking about that in relation to some of that Napoleonic War poetry. And you can also relate this to Edmund Burke and Marie Antoinette, right? They're writing these kind of pamphlets back and forth to each other. This is debate that's taking place in the public sphere, right? The public now has access to the same kind of means of getting your ideas out that rich people had always had access to, right? And another element to that is a really a good and reliable postal service, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today because it's relevant to Equiano as well. All right, what were the three estates? Do you remember what the three estates were?
I have it written down.
Okay.
The first one was, I don't know how,
Oratores, yeah. And the oratores were, like, what part of society were they?
those who pray.
Those who pray. So the clergy, right, or the first estate, right?
And then the second one was the Beltors,
Mm-hmm.
those who fight.
Right.
And then the
Laboratories, right?
those who work.
Okay, so we can basically divide that up, right? So one is clergy, right? And then two is who? Right, those who fight. And then what did that mean? Like, what chunk of society does that translate to?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so this would have been then the nobility, right? Right, because the original purpose of European aristocracies was military, right? You know, the idea was you give a knight a grant of land so that he can earn enough income to, you know, pay for a horse and armor and weapons and, you know, to raise, a peasant militia when he has to, right? So yeah, the original purpose of feudal nobility was for war, for combat. And then if the clergy is one, the nobility is two, the laboratories, those who work, who must they be? Well, who's left? What's that?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so the third estate would basically be everyone else, right? And the everyone else portion of society vastly outnumbered the praying and fighting portion of society, but also had fewer rights and virtually no privileges and frequently paid higher taxes, right? So this imbalance in power between these three estates was part of what caused the unrest in France that Burke and Wollstonecraft are writing about, right? Okay, what about Marie Antoinette? Who is Marie Antoinette?
I don't know if I wrote my notes, because I took notes on my iPad. And didn't write them.
Okay.
I remember reading about it, but
Mm-hmm.
I cannot remember.
Okay, so Marie Antoinette is the Queen of France at the time of the Revolution. And the reason that she is relevant here is that Burke, in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, devotes several paragraphs to Marie Antoinette, right? In particular, kind of like, a depiction of her as this kind of like symbol of kind of like both beauty and helplessness that should have been protected by French men. And he regards the failure of French men to protect her as, evidence of the passing away of chivalry and the older order that represented, right? And for Burke, remember that all of that is a bad thing. So it would probably be a good idea, particularly before we have any exams, right, to go back and revisit that part of Burke's piece. Because it is actually an important part of his argument. Okay, John Bull. Who or what is John Bull?
Skip.
Okay, so John Bull is a figure in British cartoons, typically, like political cartoons of the late 18th century. And he is this representation of the average, relatively prosperous, rural English person, right? So, somebody who is, not book learned, but, full of country wisdom and things like that, right? Who kind of represents public opinion. And John Bull is used frequently as a cartoon character during the Napoleonic Wars, right? There's that series of James Gilray panels that depict him being recruited for the army and then going off to war, and then what happens to him and his family as he goes off to fight in Europe, right? The family loses all their money, they have to pawn all their possessions, and then he comes back missing an eye, missing an arm, missing a leg, and the family are all, thin and diseased, and all their stuff is gone when he comes back, right? So John Bull is really he's a figure that's kind of relevant to any of those Napoleonic War poems, because it's kind of like the way he's depicted in that series is part of the public debate about whether war with France at the end of the 18th century, well, one, was going well, and two, whether it was worth it at all. All right, do you remember what Martello Towers were?
Are those the things that were like built to look old? Or is that a whole different?
Can you say a little bit louder?
Are those things that are like built to look old? Or is
No,
that
you're
something
thinking of
different?
Gothic Follies. That was from
Okay.
the previous week, right? So yeah, so the Martello Towers are these squat round towers that you see you still see them actually along the coasts of just about any British dominions. In fact, you still see a bunch of them in the Channel Islands, which are right between England and France. And they were built because there was a fear of French invasion. So these towers were built to really as more as lookout points than anything else, right? To keep an eye on the sea and to make sure that the French Navy wasn't coming over across. And it's representative of a kind of paranoia about invasion that we see in the Anna Letitia Barbald poem. What is it? 1800 and now I can't even remember the damn title. Right, 1811. Right, as she's talking near the end of that poem about how Britain has been, because it's it's an island, insulated from invasion. Right, wars have not been fought on their soil in some time. So she believed that was coming to an end, and that's part of the point of that poem. All right, so what's the Women's March to Versailles? Getting back to France.
I have it written down, not the date written down.
It's okay if you don't have the exact date. As long as you know what it is and why it matters.
I don't have anything. I don't have anything written down for it, so
Okay, so this was the event that Burke is responding to in the Reflections on the Revolution in France. chance, right? So this is the moment when a group of Paris market women, frustrated over the high cost of food, particularly bread, basically took over a garrison in Paris, stole several weapons, guns, even cannons, right? And dragged all of this out to Versailles, the king's residence out in the suburbs. And they demanded that the king do something about the high cost of bread. They got there, they found out that the king's own bakeries were in fact full of bread. And people understandably got a little salty about that. So the situation was actually resolved peacefully at the time, but Burke depicts it as a violent riot in which several members of the King's Guard are murdered or executed by the crowd, right? And you know, the Queen is chased half naked through her chambers. So Burke is taking this real event and applying the tropes that are common in a Gothic horror novel to tweak the sensibilities of his readers. And that's why this is important, right? And how it connects to other course material. Okay, Nelson's column. Okay, so Admiral Horatio Nelson is one of the great naval heroes of the Napoleonic Wars. Nelson makes his reputation as a sea captain in the West Indies, defending slave plantations. It's something that tends to be elided by the celebration of him in monuments across Britain, right? He dies gloriously in a battle against the French in the Battle of Trafalgar. And so they erect these monuments to him in various British cities, right? So these usually consist of a tall column on which you have Nelson standing, kind of looking down over the city in both a kind of triumphal and almost protective fashion, right? These Nelson's columns are a kind of symbol of British confidence during the Napoleonic Wars that are kind of counter to these Martello towers, which are a symbol of kind of like vigilance and almost paranoia, fear of invasion, right? Okay, the loud death drum, and I'm just going to go through these last three so that we actually do end up having some time to talk about Equiano. The loud death drum is mentioned specifically in Anna Letitia Barbauld's 1811, near the beginning of the poem, and refers to the drum that recruiting sergeants would beat as they walked through British villages during the Napoleonic Wars, trying to round up soldiers and seeing that they could recruit. Impressment is directly related to the Robert Southey poem, The Victory, as is the significance of church bells. Impressment is the practice of essentially taking people who haven't volunteered for military service and signing them up anyway against their will. Right? So whenever the army ran short of soldiers or the Navy ran short of sailors, they would just start rounding people up with what were called press gangs and forcing them to join the Army or the Navy. And the guy who's the main figure Southey is talking about in The Victory is a guy who was impressed into service in the Navy. And the significance of church bells, right? So church bells, like, okay, one, remember that there is no separation of church and state in Britain in the 18th century, right? The Church of England is part of the government. So when church bells ring, right, religious celebrations are also state occasions, state celebrations. And church bells typically rang in British towns for two major occasions, right? One, military victories, right? Whenever the British scored a big victory in the Napoleonic Wars, the church bells would ring throughout the country. And also funerals. And so what Robert Southey is doing in his poem, The Victory, is showing that each of these victories is also a funeral, right? For many kind of faceless, nameless British soldiers and sailors, not to mention their French counterparts. Okay, so any questions about any of this? Okay, and remember, like, all this is going to come back, right? So, you know, we're going to be talking about several of these concepts later in the semester, and some of this stuff is going to pop up on exams as well, right? So this is why I want to drill some of this, to make sure you have a vocabulary for talking about this stuff, and to help you with the future exams. The thing I'm really most concerned with is making sure you're able to connect conceptually things that are happening in British society and culture and politics and economics with the things that we're reading, right? Because these texts don't come out of nowhere. They're generated by real historical material circumstances. And so that's why we're spending so much time on this kind of stuff. Okay, so let's then get into the Equiano autobiography. So, what are your thoughts on this? How'd this go for you?
It's kind of like different.
Okay, what do you mean? What do you mean by different? Different from what?
Like some of the things I read were like weird. Like one of them I underlined when it was talking about like the dead captain's hand. I was like, that's the. And then he'll be talking about like God and stuff, and I'm like, it's crazy. It's weird.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this: like, what do you find weird about it? So you've picked out those couple of moments here, right? But what did you find weird about what he was doing?
That's the only thing like I could remember because I like read it over like trying to like comprehend like where it would have came from.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like just weird.
Okay. There are two basic strands here running through this that I want to kind of pull on as we talk about it. And I'm hoping that maybe this will help all this make a little more sense to you, right? So one thing that we want to be paying really close attention to is the sensibility discourse that we've been seeing a lot in 18th century literature, right? And just refresh my memory here. What is sensibility?
Like your emotions, like what's the thing?
Yeah, it's more specific than your emotions, though, right? It's
sensitivities to sense of impression.
Yes, exactly. It's your sensitivity to sense impressions, right? And what's the basic theory with sensibility? How is it supposed to be connected to to your morality.
Like you wouldn't do it to somebody because you don't want it done to you.
Yeah, because you can imagine, right, what this particular thing would feel like if it was done to you. So sensibility increases your imaginative capacity, and your ability to imagine other people's circumstances makes you more sympathetic and then more benevolent, right? That's the theory. We've also seen that some writers that we look at, like Coleridge, think that that's largely bullshit. But one of the ways in which writers use this notion of sensibility to try to generate imaginative sympathy in their readers is through defamiliarization. Right, we talked a little bit about this last time, right? Clarkson, for example, was trying to get us to look at Christianity from the viewpoint of an African whose only experience of Christians is slavers, right? And Equiano is doing something both more consistent and more subtle throughout this, right? So what he's doing is taking familiar everyday objects, or objects that are familiar to his English readers, and presenting them through the eyes of someone who has never seen something like this before, right? So if we look at an example here on page 106. Right, so he's talking about having to be, he's talking about having to fan the gentleman whom he's informed now owns him, right, in Virginia. He says, "Soon after I had a fan put into my hand to fan the gentleman while he slept, and so I did indeed with great fear. While he was fast asleep, I indulged myself a great deal in looking about the room, which to me appeared very fine and curious. The first object that engaged my attention was a watch, which hung on the chimney and was going. I was quite surprised at the noise it made, and I was afraid it would tell the gentleman anything I might do amiss. And when I immediately after observed a picture hanging in the room, which appeared constantly to look at me, I was still more affrighted, having never seen such things as these before. At one time I thought it was something relative to magic, and not seeing it move, I thought it might be some way the whites had to keep their great men when they died, and offer them libation as we used to do to our friendly spirits." Okay, so what are the two objects that he observes in this room that are totally normal to us?
A watch.
Yeah. Yes, the first one's a watch, right?
Iron. Is it a fan? No.
Well, I mean, yeah, the fan doesn't surprise him either, right? There's nothing that's particularly surprising to him about the fan. What's the other thing here that surprises him?
Yeah, iron muzzle.
Well, that's a little bit before, and we'll talk about that in a minute, what's going on there.
After.
Yeah, he's got but there's the watch and there's a picture, right? There's a painting
yes.
on the wall. There's a watch and a painting, right? These are the things that are unfamiliar to him. And what is he worried that these unfamiliar things must be doing? And how is he using his unfamiliarity with these objects to convey a sense of anxiety or fear to his reader?
He says that it's something relative to magic.
Okay, something relative to magic, right?
They don't move. Or like,
Mhm.
doesn't see them moving. Or, and then he said, like, we used to do with our friendly spirits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a painting, obviously, of a person, right? And if you don't know that this is just like a representation of a person, made out of oils that's hanging on a wall and can do you no harm, what does it look like the portrait might be doing in relation to you. Especially if you're in a situation where you're already a little anxious, you're already kind of nervous.
They feel like it's watching.
Yeah, that's the feeling he's describing here, right? The watch and the painting are objects that are these magic objects that are in the room to observe him, right? And to tell on him if he does something wrong. Now, a more benign example of this is his encounter with snow, right on page 107, right? It was about the beginning of the spring 1757 when I arrived in England, and I was near 12 years of age at that time. I was very much struck with the buildings and the pavement of the streets in Falmouth, and indeed, any object I saw filled me with new surprise. One morning, when I got upon the deck, I saw it covered all over with the snow that fell overnight. As I had never seen anything of the kind before, I thought it was salt. So I immediately ran down to the mate and desired him, as well as I could, to come and see how somebody in the night had thrown salt all over the deck. He, knowing what it was, desired me to bring some of it down to him. Accordingly, I took up a handful of it, which I found very cold indeed. And when I brought it to him, he desired me to taste it. I did so, and I was surprised beyond measure. So if snow is something that you're used to, right? And I know in Southwest Georgia it is something we are not typically used to, but I grew up in the mountains in Northeast Pennsylvania. We trick-or-treated in parkas, right? So like snow is something I am very familiar with. But if you're really familiar with something, how closely do you attend to its sensory qualities, right? How much close attention, like if it snows where you live every day from late October to the end of March, how closely do you pay attention to how cold or how wet snow tastes or feels? Not much, because yeah, it's just
like, it's just normal.
Exactly, it's just part of your everyday reality, right? This is like, I have to trudge through this shit to get to work, right?
It's like rain for us.
Yeah.
Like, we don't see how rain tastes, we don't do any of that.
Yeah.
It's just normal.
Yeah, there's a certain period of months where it rains at least a little bit just about every day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, that's just normal, nobody really thinks about it. But he's attending to the sense impressions of snow because he's never seen it before, right? And he's kind of trying to wake up the reader to what this thing actually seems like to somebody who's not familiar with it. Right, so defamiliarization can work often, or at least the part of the theory that develops in Romanticism is that defamiliarizing objects can help provide a kind of jolt to our imagination, right? By making the familiar somehow wonderful again. Now, probably the most important example here of this process of defamiliarization is the next paragraph at page 108. And can you read that for us, the one that starts with, I had often seen my master and Dick employed in reading.
Read it?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd often seen my master and Dick employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books, as I thought they did. And so, to learn how all things had a beginning for that purpose, I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, and then put my ears to it, went along in hopes it would answer me, and I've been very much concerned when I found it remained silent.
Okay, so what's weird about this passage? Like what's weird about what he's describing here? Yeah, but again, right? If you're somebody who's not familiar with books, right? The first time you see somebody sitting and reading, right? Maybe even mouthing along as they're going over the words, right? it looks like they're talking to this object or having some kind of conversation with this object. And so, by this time in his life, right, Equiano realizes that books don't literally talk. That you can't, he's literate now. He's written a book. But do you notice anything funny about the tense of this? It says, I have often taken up a book and have talked to it and then put my ears to it when alone in hopes it would answer me. And I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent. Is this in present tense or past tense?
It sounds like present.
Yeah. So even though he's, mastered the language and, kind of learned most of the cultural codes here by the time he writes this book, he's noting that the book still doesn't talk to him, right? And, this is not meant to be any kind of it's not meant to make him, make himself look ignorant or anything like that, right? What it is demonstrating is that it's picking up, the other major theme here. In his narrative, which is assimilation into another culture, and the difficulty of doing so, especially when your point of entry into that culture is as a piece of someone else's property. Right, so as much as he accommodates himself to the English language and to British culture generally, he always depicts himself as being in some sense an outsider. Right? Somebody who's always just kind of looking in. Right? We see that also in the episode where he watches the little girl's mother wash her face, right? Right, page 109 here, right? I had often observed that when her mother washed her face, it looked very rosy, but when she washed mine, it did not look so. I therefore tried oftentimes myself if I could not by washing make my face of the same color as my little playmate Mary, but it was all in vain. And I now began to be mortified at the difference in our complexions. So there's a recognition here of his difference, not just in color, but also in status, right, with the people around him, right? Remember, he's just a boy at the beginning of this, right? And when he comes to England for the first time, he's 12 years old. And as he's growing up, he's recognizing more and more how other people in England are different from him and are treated differently from him, right? So there's a kind of gradual realization that occurs here. And I want us to look for a second at certain elements of Equiano's self-presentation here, because this is relevant to the larger argument he's making and to the way Black Britons lived in the late 18th century. And are you waking up or no? Does it appear to be doing anything?
The light's blue.
All right, I don't know what that means. Let's press this again. All right, all the time it made a noise.
No, there's a blinking blue light.
Okay.
So it might be turned on.
Okay. All right, there we go. It's coming to life. Okay, so this is the frontispiece. That is kind of like the front page matter of the second edition of Equiano's book. Right. So the fact that it had gone into a second edition by 1789, right, meant it was actually selling really well. Right. They had to order a second printing. So have a look here for a minute at the picture, his portrait here. Turn the lights off so you can see it a little better. And just tell me what you notice about it, about the way he's presenting himself in terms of his, style, his dress, his hairstyle, even, his pose.
He looks like, I don't know how to word that, like, I was gonna say like put together, but like, not like,
Okay, does his style of dress look more English or more African?
English.
Yeah, he's dressed here like an Englishman, right? He's got his waistcoat, his little frilly cravat, and the coat with the buttons. And his hair is cut in English fashion. And can you see the book that he's holding?
Honestly,
Okay. Well,
kind of blends with the shirt.
So he's got a Bible open on his lap here, right? It's open to the Acts of the Apostles, and he's got his thumb on a particular passage. And the usual interpretation of this picture is that his thumb is on the passage from the book of Acts in which the Ethiopian is converted to Christianity. So he's presenting himself here as an Englishman and as a Christian convert. And yet, if we look at the title, the title of the portrait here, or the full title that he gives to his book, does he call himself Olaudah Equiano, the English Christian convert? How does he refer to himself?
I don't know what that says on this side.
Okay, this is Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, the African.
Shows referring to something like that as an African. So
Yeah.
it's not putting out there that he's an Englishman.
Yeah. It's this weird kind of dual identity, right? Is that even the two names are a dual identity, right? Olaudah Equiano being the birth name, right, the name he was given among his own people, and Gustavus Vasa being the name that Captain Michael Pascal, the guy who bought him in Virginia and carted him around on a ship for years, gave him, right? So, what we have here is a guy who's got a foot in two different worlds. And I wouldn't say he's necessarily bridging those two worlds, right? Because, examples like the talking book episode demonstrate that he's not. That he recognizes limits to his ability to assimilate. But where was I going with that? I felt like I was on a roll. But yeah, so there is this desire to embrace and celebrate that past identity, right? But the past Equiano and the present Gustavus Vasa have a hard time coexisting in the same world, in the same society, right? If that makes sense. So, the other thing that I think is interesting about this frontispiece here is the last element of the title here. What do we notice up here? Written by himself, yeah. Now I want to pair this with another piece of information. Equiano was the first British author that we know of to undertake a book tour, right? To go out and give public readings of his book. Why do you think that might be? And try to think back to some of the things we've said the last couple of classes about prevailing racial attitudes in Britain.
Like he couldn't read before, correct?
Yeah,
Like now that
he learns to read as a teenager, yeah.
So now that he's learned to read, he wants to like show people, or like there might be people like him that couldn't read, so they want to read to him.
Okay, I think, yeah, keep going. I think we're kind of moving in the right direction here. Let me ask you this. Might an author like Equiano have to prove certain things to certain people? Yeah, there would probably be a relatively sizable chunk of people in Britain who wouldn't believe an African man capable of writing his own autobiography, right? Because there was this prevailing belief in the natural inferiority of Africans. That, there were, some people who went so far as to say that they were part of a separate creation from white people, right? That God created white people and then created Africans separately to be servants to white people, right? And I think that this is also a big part of Equiano's embrace of, the Bible here in this picture, right? Is showing that he is a Christian like any other Briton, and indeed, can't read. He's got a book open on his lap, and going on the public book tour and giving readings to people was a way of demonstrating this thing that he insists in the title, right? Written by himself, right? No one wrote this for me. I didn't have help, right? I wrote my own damn book, people. And he's also, he's helped by people like Thomas Clarkson, right? Clarkson doesn't help him write the book, but Clarkson puts him in touch with other like-minded individuals. And Equiano works closely with Clarkson's Committee for the Abolition of Slavery. So, to tell you just a little bit more about Equiano and his activities. He's a member of a group called the Sons of Africa. And the Sons of Africa are, on the one hand, a corresponding society. Now, I'm going to assume that since people don't write letters to each other anymore, you probably don't know what this means. So essentially a corresponding society, and corresponding societies were a big part of this 18th century public sphere in Britain, right? They were essentially groups of people with a similar goal or interest who helped to kind of organize efforts for political lobbying by writing letters to each other. So kind of like the same way people will use social media for organizing now. In the 18th century, people were writing letters to do that. So it was a little bit slower process, but it was the same basic thing, right? If you want people to show up for a protest or for a lobbying effort or whatever, right? You write to the other members of the corresponding society, and let's all be in Westminster at the Parliament building at this date, and they do so, right? And members of corresponding societies also would, have kind of like debates with each other in their letters frequently. They debate public issues. So that was the primary thing the Sons of Africa was. It was also a lobbying group. Right? They were actively lobbying Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade and for better treatment and kind of more political rights for Black Britons. So in addition to Equiano, who's probably the best known member of this group now, others in this group included a guy by the name of Ignatius Sancho. Sancho was, he owned a bakery, right? He owned his own business. And he came to realize that because he owned his own business, that entitled him to vote in parliamentary elections, right? He was technically one of the 2% of British citizens who was actually able to vote. So in 1774, he becomes the first Black person on record to vote in Britain. And he shows up at the polling place. He's like, I'm here to vote. And the people running the polls, are questioning this. It's like, well, how are you eligible to vote? But he provides his proof. It's like, hey, this is the deed to my business, right? And there was nothing they could do to stop it. So yeah, Sancho is the first known Black person to vote in Britain. He was also a composer and wrote in the 1770s a series of minuets and country dances. That was the music that I was playing at the beginning of class. Another important member of this group was a freed slave by the name of Olaudah, whom Equiano helped to learn to read and to put him in touch with abolitionist groups. And Equiano wrote a very well-known abolitionist tract that was widely circulated. It was sent even to King George III, but as far as we know, George III, who tended to be in favor of the slave trade, made a lot of money for the royal family, didn't read it. But yeah, these three guys are extremely important movers and shakers in the small but surprisingly influential Black British community of the late 18th century. Now, through their efforts, a couple of things happen. One is the founding of a colony called Freetown, which is now the capital of the modern nation of Sierra Leone. And Freetown was supposed to be a community for freed slaves to return to Africa and to live in West Africa. The problem with Freetown, and it's a similar problem to what happened with the United States founding of Liberia, that you had people from different ethnic groups who didn't always speak the same language, the same native language, who frequently came from ethnic groups that did not like each other particularly. And so these kinds of rivalries, in addition to a general kind of lack of funding and attention from the British government, made the Freetown experiment not as successful as it could have been. But yeah, it was a thing that happened and it genuinely existed. Now, in terms of the actual effect on the slave trade that their lobbying had. So, what happens over time, over a period of about 40 years, is the gradual wearing away through legislation of the British slave trade. So in 1788, as a response to the Zong incident, slightly belated since that happened almost a decade earlier, the Slave Act limited the number of slaves who could be transported on any given ship. Right, so they weren't allowed, so this was a focus on the conditions rather than the state of slavery, right? Better material conditions. Okay, you can't cram people into these, you can't cram as many people into these tight quarters, so they'll be slightly less uncomfortable. Now in 1807, the buying and selling of slaves in British dominions is outlawed, right? This doesn't set anybody free, but it does at least legally end the importation of slaves from West Africa into British colonies in the West Indies, and prevents planters in the West Indies from buying more slaves or selling slaves to other people. And then in 1811, slave trading is made a felony. Right. Prior to that, it was a misdemeanor, a fine and a slap on the wrist. And then in 1883, the Slavery Abolition Act is passed. Now, the date here, 1833, right? So what had to happen in order for this to occur, we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the 1830s, but essentially the lock that the West India planters and aristocratic interests had on Parliament had to be broken. And in 1832, a law was passed that allowed more people to vote and allowed for more even representation across Britain. So this allowed more people who were anti-slavery to get elected to Parliament. So they actually had a hope of passing genuine reforms. And so what this particular act did, right, it emancipated slaves throughout the British Empire with the exception of India, which was run by a private corporation at the time. However, it didn't immediately set people free. There was an apprenticeship period where former slaves continued to be apprenticed to the people who owned them for 6 years. At the end of which period, they would be set free. And the slave owners at the end of that 6 years would be compensated for the loss of their property. So we have here, an early example of reparations, right? But the reparations are paid to the slave owners, not to the former slaves, who have to wait an additional 6 years in several colonies to get their freedom. And a big part of this is that in many of these colonies, particularly in the West Indies, the black population outnumbered the white population by enormous factors. So the white planters were very much afraid essentially of receiving the same kind of treatment that they had been dealing out once once emancipation occurred. But there's one more thing that I want to kind of lean on a little bit here that is part of Equiano's discourse and is also, I think, related to the whole, insistence on, this narrative having been written by himself and, going on the book tour to tell his own story, right? There's also a pattern of silencing that we see running through this. And you notice that with the iron muzzle. You notice the iron muzzle that the woman was wearing, right? What's that supposed to do? Right. While I was in this plantation, the gentleman to whom I suppose the estate belonged, being unwell, I was one day sent for to his dwelling house to fan him. When I came into the room where he was, I was very much affrighted at some things I saw, and the more so as I had seen a black woman slave as I came through the house, who was cooking the dinner, and the poor creature was cruelly loaded with various kinds of iron machines. She had one particularly on her head, which locked her mouth so fast that she could scarcely speak, and could not eat or drink. So what's the primary function of this iron muzzle?
It's like the thing, like what the dogs have. Like you can't,
Yeah, you put a muzzle on a dog to stop it from barking, right?
like barking, biting, everything.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing for like a human.
Yeah, basically what it is in this case, it's a silencing device, right? It's placed on her head so that she can't talk, right? And when Equiano insists on keeping the name that he was called in the plantation, rather than adopting the name Gustavus Vasa that Captain Pascal wants to give him, right? Pascal forces the new name on him by hitting him, right? And every time he tries to assert his rights or assert his humanity, he's silenced, usually through either violence or the threat of violence. And so I think a big part of this insistence on telling his own story is about a refusal to be quiet, right? A refusal to be silenced. And perhaps even to speak for people like this woman he saw on the plantation, who literally could not speak for herself because of the device she was forced to wear. All right, so that's pretty much what I've got for you today. Do you have any questions about anything? All right, so let me give you the guide questions then for next time we're going to be looking at. We're going to start looking more closely at romantic poetry. Capital R romantic, not small r romantic. And so we're going to be doing a Wordsworth poem. So let me just give you the questions for that. And we'll see you on Monday.